Jake Harrison had always believed that fate was nothing more than coincidence dressed up in fancy clothes. But as he stood in the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Montana, watching the autumn wind scatter leaves like forgotten promises, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change his life forever. The year was 1987, and at 32, Jake had spent the better part of his adult life drifting from one small town to another, fixing engines and mending broken things, never staying long enough to call any place home. His calloused hands told the story of a man who had worked hard for everything he had, which wasn't much beyond the clothes on his back, a worn leather jacket, and an old Ford pickup that had seen better decades. Cedar Ridge was supposed to be just another stop, another temporary fix before moving on to wherever the road might take him next. The town itself seemed trapped in time, with its weathered storefronts and residents who moved with the unhurried pace of people who had nowhere urgent to be. Jake had rolled into town 3 days ago when his truck started making that particular grinding noise that every mechanic learns to fear, the kind that suggests major repairs and even bigger bills. He'd found work at Murphy's garage, and old Tom Murphy had been kind enough to let him sleep in the back room until he earned enough to get his truck roadworthy again. It was honest work, the kind that left him tired but satisfied at the end of each day, and for the first time in years, Jake found himself wondering what it might be like to stay somewhere longer than a few weeks. The thought both terrified and intrigued him, like standing at the edge of a cliff and wondering what it would feel like to fly. That Tuesday afternoon started like any other, with Jake elbow-deep in the engine of a stubborn Chevrolet that refused to cooperate, when he heard the commotion outside. At first, it sounded like nothing more than raised voices and the neighing of horses, but something in the tone made him wipe his hands on a rag and step outside to investigate. What he saw made his blood run cold and awakened something primal in his chest that he hadn't felt since his days in the army. 3 men on horseback had cornered a woman and a young girl near the general store, and even from a distance, Jake could see the fear in their postures. The men wore the kind of clothes that suggested they lived outside the law, with dust-covered boots and guns that hung too easily on their hips. The woman was maybe 40, with auburn hair that caught the afternoon light, and she was clutching the hand of a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. They both wore the simple but clean clothes of people who worked hard for their living, and there was something about the way the woman held herself, even in the face of obvious danger, that spoke of quiet strength and dignity. Jake had learned long ago that there were moments in life when a man had to choose between safety and doing what was right, and this was clearly one of those moments. Without stopping to think about the consequences or the fact that he was outnumbered 3-1, Jake grabbed the tire iron from his workbench and started walking toward the confrontation with the kind of determined stride that had once carried him across foreign battlefields. As he got closer, he could hear fragments of the conversation, enough to understand that these men weren't just passing through town looking for supplies. They were the kind of trouble that had been plaguing small towns across Montana for months, bandits who took what they wanted and left devastation in their wake. The leader, a man with a scar running down his left cheek and eyes the color of winter storms, was speaking to the woman in the kind of low, threatening voice that made Jake's jaw clench with barely contained rage. He was demanding something, money or valuables, and when the woman shook her head and tried to back away, one of the other men dismounted and grabbed her arm roughly enough to make her cry out. That was all Jake needed to see. He had never been the type to start fights, but he had also never been one to walk away from one when innocent people were in danger. The tire iron felt solid and familiar in his grip as he approached the group, and something in his bearing must have communicated his intentions because all 4 people turned to look at him with expressions ranging from hope to annoyance to outright hostility. The scarred man sized him up with the kind of calculating look that predators give potential prey, clearly trying to decide whether Jake represented a real threat or just another obstacle to be brushed aside. For a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the gaps between buildings and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the residential part of town. Then Jake spoke, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of experience with violence and the confidence that comes from knowing you're fighting for something worth fighting for. He told the men to leave the women alone and get out of town, simple words that carried the weight of absolute conviction. What happened next unfolded with the kind of brutal efficiency that Jake had hoped never to need again. But muscle memory and training kicked in as the bandits decided that one man with a tire iron wasn't worth worrying about. They were wrong. The first man to reach for his gun found himself on the ground with a broken wrist before he even cleared leather, and the second discovered that Jake could move with surprising speed for someone who spent most of his time bent over car engines. The leader proved more of a challenge, but even he was no match for someone who had learned to fight in places where second place meant not coming home. When the dust settled, 2 of the bandits were unconscious. The third was riding hard out of town with what Jake suspected was a concussion, and the street was quiet except for the sound of heavy breathing and the soft crying of the young girl who had been clinging to her mother throughout the entire confrontation. The woman, who Jake would soon learn was named Margaret Sullivan, looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and something else that he couldn't quite identify, something that made his heart beat faster and his mouth go suddenly dry. She was beautiful in the way that women who had lived through hardship often were, with lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure, and hands that showed the evidence of hard work but remained graceful despite their calluses. When she thanked him, her voice was steady but her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and Jake found himself wishing he had done something more significant than chase off a few bandits if it meant seeing that expression of gratitude directed at him. Margaret explained that she was a widow, that her husband had died 2 years ago in a logging accident, and that she had been trying to make a life for herself and her daughter Emma in Cedar Ridge despite the challenges that came with being a single woman in a town where most people believed a woman needed a man to take care of her. She ran a small boarding house on the edge of town, she told him, and it was clear from the way she spoke about her work that she took pride in providing clean rooms and good meals for the occasional travelers who found their way to Cedar Ridge. Emma, meanwhile, had inherited her mother's beauty but none of her caution when it came to strangers, and she looked at Jake with the kind of open admiration that made him uncomfortable in the way that compliments from children always did. She was at that awkward age between childhood and womanhood, with her mother's green eyes and a smile that suggested she didn't yet fully understand how dangerous the world could be. As the 3 of them walked back toward the boarding house, Margaret explaining that she wanted to thank him properly for what he had done, Jake found himself noticing details about Cedar Ridge that he had missed during his first few days in town. The way the mountains framed the valley like protective walls, the sound of the creek that ran behind the main street, the way the evening light made everything look softer and more welcoming than he had initially thought. For the first time in years, he could imagine staying somewhere long enough to learn the names of all the streets and the stories behind the faces he passed on his daily walks. Margaret's boarding house turned out to be a 2-story white building with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that suggested someone who believed in making beauty even in the midst of hardship. The interior was clean and comfortable without being fancy, the kind of place where a person could feel at home without feeling judged for their circumstances. Margaret insisted on cooking dinner for him, despite his protests that he had only done what any decent person would do, and as they sat around her kitchen table eating beef stew and fresh bread, Jake found himself thinking that this might be what normal people meant when they talked about family dinners. Emma chattered throughout the meal, asking Jake questions about his travels and his work with an enthusiasm that made him remember what it had been like to be young and believe that the world was full of adventures waiting to be discovered. Margaret was quieter, but Jake caught her watching him with an expression that made him wonder what she was thinking, and whether she was judging him or simply trying to figure out what kind of man risked his safety for strangers. After dinner, as Emma helped clear the dishes and Margaret prepared coffee, Jake found himself looking around the kitchen and trying to imagine what it would be like to come home to this kind of warmth every evening. The thought scared him almost as much as it appealed to him, because he had spent so many years avoiding exactly this kind of domestic tranquility, convinced that he wasn't the type of man who deserved such simple happiness. As the evening wore on and the conversation flowed more easily, Jake learned more about the Sullivan family and their struggles to make a life in Cedar Ridge. Margaret had grown up in the town, had married her childhood sweetheart right after high school, and had been genuinely happy until the accident that took her husband's life and left her alone with a teenage daughter and a business that barely broke even in the best of months. She spoke about her late husband with the kind of fond sadness that suggested she had truly loved him but had also made peace with his loss, and Jake found himself envying a dead man for having been loved so completely by someone so remarkable. Emma, he learned, was a bright student who dreamed of going to college, but understood that such dreams might have to wait until their financial situation improved. She helped her mother with the boarding house and never complained about the work, but Jake could see in her eyes the same restlessness that had driven him to leave every place he had ever called home. When it came time for him to return to Murphy's garage, Margaret walked him to the door and stood on the porch watching him walk away, and Jake felt her eyes on his back like a physical weight that both comforted and unsettled him. He spent that night lying on his cot in the back of the garage, staring at the ceiling and thinking about green eyes and auburn hair, and the way Margaret's hand had felt when she had briefly touched his arm while thanking him again for his help. For the first time in his adult life, he found himself wondering what it would be like to have someone care whether he came home safely at the end of each day, and the thought both thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. The next morning, Jake threw himself into his work with the kind of focused intensity that had always been his way of avoiding uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. But Cedar Ridge was a small town, and Margaret's boarding house was only a few blocks from Murphy's garage, which meant that he found himself walking past her street on his way to lunch and catching glimpses of her hanging laundry in the backyard or Emma reading on the front porch. Each time he saw them, he felt that same strange flutter in his chest, as if his heart couldn't decide whether it wanted to race or stop altogether. Tom Murphy, who had been watching Jake with the shrewd eyes of someone who had spent 70 years learning to read people, finally cornered him Thursday afternoon and asked if he was planning to ask Margaret Sullivan to dinner or if he was going to spend the rest of his time in Cedar Ridge walking past her house like a lovesick teenager. The old man's bluntness made Jake laugh despite himself, but it also forced him to confront the truth that he had been dancing around for days. He was attracted to Margaret in a way that went beyond physical appreciation, drawn to her strength and independence and the quiet dignity with which she faced the challenges of her life. But he was also terrified of the implications of such feelings, because caring about someone meant risking the kind of pain that came when you inevitably lost them, and Jake had lost enough people in his life to know that such pain could be devastating. Tom, who had apparently appointed himself as Jake's unofficial advisor in matters of the heart, pointed out that life was short and opportunities for genuine happiness were rare, especially for men who had seen as much of the world's ugliness as Jake had. He suggested that maybe it was time for Jake to stop running from the possibility of connection and start running toward it instead, advice that was both simple and terrifying in its conversation that followed was unlike anything either of them had ever experienced, a careful exploration of feelings and possibilities that had been building between them for weeks. They talked about the difference in their ages, which turned out to be less significant than Jake had imagined, and about the challenges of blending their lives together in a small town where people paid close attention to their neighbor's business. They discussed Emma and how she would react to the news that her mother and the man she had come to admire were planning to build a life together. And they made plans for approaching her with sensitivity and honesty about their feelings and their hopes for the future. As the evening grew later and their conversation grew deeper, Jake found himself marveling at the unexpected turns his life had taken since arriving in Cedar Ridge. He had come to town as a drifter with no plans beyond earning enough money to get his truck fixed and move on to the next temporary stop, but he was going to leave as a man with a future and a family and the kind of roots he had never imagined he would want. Margaret, meanwhile, was discovering that the security she had been seeking could come not from a practical arrangement, but from genuine love and partnership with someone who saw her as an equal and a companion rather than just a solution to his problems. 3 days later, Jake proposed to Margaret in the same place where they had first truly talked about their feelings, on the front porch of her boarding house with Emma inside practicing her guitar and the mountains of Montana providing a backdrop that seemed to bless their union. Margaret said yes with tears in her eyes and a smile that made Jake feel like the luckiest man alive, and when they went inside to tell Emma the news, she surprised them both by jumping up and hugging them with enthusiasm that suggested she had been hoping for exactly this outcome all along. Emma confessed that she had been watching them fall in love over the past weeks and had been wondering when they would figure out what was obvious to everyone else in town, namely that they belonged together in a way that had nothing to do with practical arrangements and everything to do with the kind of love that people spent their entire lives hoping to find. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small church on the hill overlooking Cedar Ridge, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance and Emma serving as Margaret's maid of honor. Jake had never imagined himself as the type of man who would cry at his own wedding, but when Margaret walked down the aisle wearing her mother's wedding dress and looking more beautiful than he had thought humanly possible, he found himself wiping away tears and not caring who saw them. Tom Murphy served as his best man, grumbling good-naturedly about losing his best mechanic to domestic bliss but admitting that he had never seen Jake look happier or more settled. The reception was held in the community hall, with food prepared by the women of the town and music provided by a local band that played waltzes and polkas with enthusiasm if not perfect technique. Jake danced with his new wife and then with his new daughter, and as the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, he found himself thinking that this was what happiness felt like. This sense of belonging and being loved and having people who depended on him not out of desperation but out of choice. Margaret was radiant throughout the evening, accepting congratulations and good wishes with the grace of someone who had found exactly what she had been looking for, even when she hadn't been sure what that was. Emma charmed everyone by giving a speech about how she had gained not just a stepfather but a friend and protector who had already shown her family more kindness than they had any right to expect from a stranger. As the months passed and Jake settled into his new role as husband and stepfather, he discovered that married life suited him in ways he had never expected. The boarding house thrived under their joint management, with Jake handling the maintenance and repairs while Margaret took care of the guests and the day-to-day operations. Emma flourished under the stability and security that Jake's presence provided, her grades improving and her confidence growing as she prepared for her final year of high school and began making concrete plans for college. Jake found that being a stepfather came naturally to him, and he took pride in helping Emma with her homework, teaching her practical skills like changing the oil in a car, and serving as a sounding board when she needed to talk through the kinds of problems that teenagers face as they navigate the transition to adulthood. Margaret bloomed as a married woman, the stress lines around her eyes fading as she relaxed into the security of partnership and shared responsibility. She and Jake worked together like partners who had been planning their moves for years, complementing each other's strengths and compensating for each other's weaknesses with an ease that made their neighbors comment on how perfectly matched they seemed. Their physical relationship developed with a tenderness and passion that surprised them both. Two people who had thought they knew what love was like discovering that there were depths of intimacy and connection they had never imagined possible. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of Jake's new life was how much he enjoyed the simple domesticity that he had spent years avoiding. Coming home to Margaret's cooking and Emma's chatter, falling asleep next to someone who cared whether he was warm enough under the covers, waking up to the smell of coffee and the sound of women's voices discussing the day ahead, these small pleasures turned out to be more satisfying than any of the adventures he had pursued during his years of wandering. He discovered that there was a deep satisfaction in being needed and depended upon, in knowing that his presence made a difference in the daily lives of people he loved, and in building something permanent and meaningful rather than just passing through other people's lives like a temporary visitor. As Emma's high school graduation approached, the family began making concrete plans for her future, and Jake insisted on contributing to her college fund despite Margaret's protests that he had already given them more than enough. Emma had been accepted to the University of Montana with a partial scholarship, and she planned to study education with the goal of returning to teach in small towns like Cedar Ridge where good teachers were always in short supply. Jake was proud of her ambition and determination, and he found himself looking forward to the day when she would come home with stories of her college adventures and perhaps a young man worthy of her affection. The morning of Emma's graduation dawned bright and clear, with the kind of mountain sunshine that made everything look more beautiful and hopeful than usual. Margaret spent extra time getting ready, wanting to look her best for her daughter's big day, and Jake put on his only suit, a navy blue outfit that he had bought for the wedding and hardly worn since. Emma looked radiant in her cap and gown, her face glowing with excitement and pride as she prepared to walk across the stage and accept her diploma. The ceremony was held in the school gymnasium, with folding chairs arranged in neat rows and decorations that the junior